Richard's lifeless body hung limply from Cade's hand. The system notifications still hovered in his mind, but he barely registered them. For the first time in his life, Cade had killed another human. He expected to feel something. Some sort of guilt or remorse at his actions. Horror at what he had just done. But instead, he mostly felt uncertainty. Richard had tried to manipulate his mind. The moment Cade recognized that, he had acted without hesitation. Any creature willing to tamper with another's thoughts crossed a line he refused to tolerate. He had made himself that promise within the great tree, and he kept it. But had there been another way? Richard had been so much weaker than Cade that the fight hadn't even resembled a fight. Cade had intended to destroy the man's core, but somewhere along the way, that plan had changed. Whether it was because of his own curiosity or inexperience with system cores, he didn't know. Earl had accused Richard of murdering dozens of people. Maybe even hundreds. If that was true, Cade couldn't honestly say he regretted the outcome. But accusations weren't proof. The only thing Cade knew for certain was that Richard had attacked him first and then attempted to influence his mind with a skill. He let out a slow sigh. The morality of his actions could wait. Right now, he had far more immediate questions to answer. Did I just rip out Richard's soul through his system core? The thought sent a chill racing down Cade's spine. The colorless, amorphous knot of energy certainly hadn't resembled any type of essence he had encountered before. It wasn't mana, life essence, or even the pure essence constantly flowing through his own channels. Instead, it reminded him of the strange, nearly invisible substance the system extracted from a corpse and funneled into his body whenever he killed a creature. Experience. But this wasn't the same. He could still feel his ash and pure essence enveloping the strange knot as it moved through his channels. Rather than dispersing or being absorbed, the ash escorted it deeper into his body. The sensation felt deliberate, almost as though it had been given a destination and was simply following a path already laid before it. What the hell is happening? He muttered. His grip loosened, and Richard's body dropped onto the stone platform with a dull thud. Cade barely spared it a glance, though he did flick a fragment of his will toward the ashen vortex, instructing it to consume the corpse. Richard was already dead. It wasn't as though he had any further use for his body. Besides, there was still life essence within it that could be converted into pure essence. White particles immediately engulfed the corpse, reducing flesh, bone, and clothing alike into drifting wisps of pure essence. The essence flowed into Cade's channels almost unnoticed. It was little more than a trickle compared to the roaring torrent already coursing through him. Ever since connecting the dungeon core to his soul, the amount of essence he could draw had become almost absurd. Maintaining the small ashen vortex required so little effort that he scarcely noticed the drain, so he allowed it to continue protecting his body while nearly all of his focus shifted toward the tiny bundle of ash winding through his channels. The sensation grew stronger, and he instinctively knew the ash wasn't wandering his channels aimlessly. It knew exactly where it was going, and more importantly, it seemed to know exactly where it was taking the strange remnant taken from Richard. Cade followed the feeling inward as it traveled through his torso before finally reaching the black and white core nestled within his abdomen. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the bundle pass directly into his core. Panic flared in his chest. What is going to happen if another soul even enters my core? He had no idea. Vorduin and Verosk had explained how a core connected the body, spirit, and soul, but neither had mentioned anything about what happened if another soul somehow entered that connection. Not wanting to leave the answer to chance, Cade immediately pushed his consciousness inward. The world around him disappeared, and moments later he found himself floating once more within his soul space. A growing root system stretched beneath him while his law sprout of inviolable self dominated the center of the endless darkness. Attached to one of its roots, his core slowly rotated, its black and white halves circling one another in perfect balance. He arrived just in time to see the tiny bundle of white ash containing the remnants of Richard move through the black and white roots. It climbed through the network before disappearing into the yin-yang sphere of Cade's core. Cade stared in disbelief. He felt no pain or pressure as the remnant disappeared. If anything, his core seemed to welcome the foreign presence. As if the core itself was waiting for the remnants to enter. Curiosity quickly replaced his concern, and he knew there was only one way to find out what was happening. Cade focused on the slowly rotating core, and almost immediately, he felt the same strange pull he had experienced shortly after returning to the tutorial. This time he didn't resist. Instead, Cade leaned into the sensation, willing his consciousness into the core. His awareness was sucked into the black and white sphere as though it had its own gravitational field. Pressure enveloped him from every direction. It felt as though his mind had been squeezed through a tunnel barely wide enough to contain it. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure vanished and space unfolded into darkness filled with streaks of dense green life essence all around him. Where am I? Cade tried to move but he quickly found that he had no body. As he tried to look around, a faint glow caught his attention. Far above him floated a small sphere of brilliant white light that he recognized immediately. It was the pure essence escorting the colorless remains of Richard, and it was moving upward through the life essence-filled darkness. Even though he had no body, he willed himself upwards, wanting to follow wherever his essence was going. His awareness surged effortlessly as his will took over. He felt no sensation of wind or movement, but he could tell that he was closing in on the light. The darkness gave way as he reached the orb and Cade saw that he was surrounded by roots. Massive roots, each corresponding to a streak of dense green life essence. They stretched in every direction, weaving together into a seemingly endless subterranean labyrinth. The glowing orb continued climbing through the vast root system, and Cade's consciousness followed close behind. A moment later, they both burst through the surface and brilliant light flooded his vision. He instinctively recoiled before remembering he didn't possess eyes in this form. As his awareness adjusted, the landscape came into focus and his breath caught in his throat. Towering above him stood the great tree. His great tree. The one he grew after burning the original down. He had emerged right beside the combined root pillar, where black and white roots spiraled together beneath shimmering veins of every color, their boundaries blending into a flowing band of grey. His great tree was much smaller than the original, perhaps only 100 meters tall. To his left, he could see the gleaming ash-white root pillar covered in overlapping scute-like plates. To his right was the deep black root pillar intertwined with shimmering rainbow veins. The trunk itself was a rich hardwood streaked with light devouring black that reminded him of his law sprout of inviolable self. A wave of relief settled over Cade. Whatever had happened when he made the dungeon core his own, it hadn't erased everything. The great tree still stood exactly where he had left it, and if it had survived the transition, then perhaps the rest of Cynthia's legacy had as well. Cade slowly turned his awareness toward himself. Or at least, toward where he thought he should have been. Just as he thought, he had no form to speak of. The realization should have unsettled him, yet it didn't. This wasn't the first time he had existed as little more than a consciousness floating in space. After Sildraxa's attack, he had found himself watching the birth of the system from a similarly bodiless perspective. The difference was that then, he had merely been an observer. He had drifted where the vision carried him, unable to alter his course. But now he felt as though he could go anywhere. It wasn't movement in the conventional sense. Rather, it felt like this space was part of him. If he wished to look out the top of the great tree, he somehow knew he could. If he wished to bury himself beneath its roots once more, all he had to do was will for it to happen. Wherever he was, the space answered to his will. That's a bit terrifying. Am I a god here? Fortunately, he didn't have time to spiral into existential questions as he had something that currently demanded his attention. The glowing sphere of pure essence and the remnant taken from Richard continued its steady ascent through the trunk of the great tree, and Cade's curiosity about where it was going outweighed everything else. Instead of experimenting with his newfound freedom, he simply willed himself to follow the glowing orb. One instant he hovered near the roots. The next he found himself within the trunk itself. Towering columns of living wood surrounded him on every side. Vast channels carried streams of life essence through the heartwood, pulsing with a rhythm like veins and arteries through a colossal body. The glowing orb floated effortlessly upward within, never wavering from its destination. I could stop it, he realized. With nothing more than a thought, he felt certain he could redirect the ash, separate Richard's remnant from it, or even send both hurtling back toward the roots if he wished. The temptation lingered for several moments before Cade pushed it aside. No. He wanted answers, and interfering now would only muddy the waters. For the moment, he would simply observe. If the strange bundle showed any sign of becoming a threat, or if something felt wrong, then he would intervene. The glowing orb continued climbing through the immense trunk. The hardwood gradually narrowed around him as massive limbs split away in every direction and, eventually, the glowing sphere reached the very highest branch. It slowed and Cade drifted closer. The ash carrying Richard's remnant settled gently against the branch's very tip. The pure essence surrounding it seeped into the living wood first, disappearing beneath the bark like water soaking into thirsty soil. The colorless remnant followed, and for several long seconds nothing happened. Then a tiny bud emerged from its tip. It unfurled with graceful ease, each movement deliberate and almost reverent. 5 pristine white petals curled outward one by one until they formed a perfect blossom no larger than Cade's outstretched hand would have been. The flower possessed an almost ethereal beauty. Its 5 petals shimmered with a faint pearlescent glow, each one so pure that they seemed almost unnatural. Fine ivory veins branched gracefully from the flower's center to the edge of every petal, glowing softly with pure essence. Emerging from the blossom's heart stood a single pitch-black pistil, its surface threaded with vibrant rainbow veins that pulsed gently with life. The flower released no pollen. Instead, tiny motes of pure essence drifted lazily into the air. They rose from the flower's center before dissolving into the surrounding atmosphere like evaporating snow carried upon a gentle breeze. Cade stared at it for a moment, mesmerized by its beauty. Well, I didn't expect that. He lingered there for several minutes, appreciating the beauty that could come from something so ugly. He watched the blossom release an endless trickle of pure essence into the sky. Aside from that gentle release, nothing else changed. The colorless remnant had completely disappeared, absorbed into the flower as though it had always belonged there. And more importantly, he felt no threat or hostility coming from the blossom. No trace of Richard remained. No lurking consciousness. No malicious intent waiting for an opportunity to seize control. The last thing he needed was Richard somehow haunting his soul realm, or dungeon, or whatever this place was now. With his curiosity finally satisfied, Cade turned his attention back to the ground below. There was another question that had been nagging at him ever since binding the dungeon core to himself. Had the denizens of Cynthia's legacy survived? The great tree clearly had, and, if the tree remained, surely the creatures within had survived as well. With that thought, Cade willed himself downward, his awareness sweeping across the landscape in search of the frogs, the tortoises, and his not-so-little gator buddy, Acolion. The towering branches blurred together before giving way to the sprawling roots beneath the great tree. He swept his awareness across the landscape, searching for any sign of familiar faces. It didn't take long. Off to one side of the great tree, gathered around the ash-white root pillar armored in overlapping skewed-like plates, sat the frogs atop their walker lilies. Pearl rested near the front of the gathering on top of Verosk's old pad. Dozens of her kin clustered onto their own walker lilies around the immense root. Much to Cade's surprise, Vorduin stood among them, his pearlescent shell gleaming softly beneath the filtered light that drifted through the canopy overhead. Relief washed through him. They're alive. Without hesitation, he willed himself closer. The world shifted around him and an instant later, he hovered only a few paces from the gathering. Pearl. No one reacted. Vorduin? He could see the ancient tortoise was speaking with the frogs but he couldn't make out what the emperor was saying. The words themselves never reached him and it seemed like Cade's words didn't reach them either. Cade drifted even closer. Maybe I'm just a spirit. It certainly seemed possible. He had no body, no voice, and no physical presence whatsoever. Then another thought occurred to him. If anyone could perceive him in this state, it should have been Vorduin. The old emperor possessed essence sight. If a disembodied consciousness floating through the great tree couldn't be detected by that skill, Cade doubted anyone else here stood a chance. Determined to test the idea, he floated directly in front of Vorduin's face and willed imaginary hands to wave back and forth. The old tortoise didn't even blink. Cade tried shouting next, then leaned forward until he was practically nose to nose with the emperor. Nothing he did seemed to have any effect. Vorduin's attention never wavered from the frogs gathered around him. If Vorduin couldn't perceive him, then Verosk probably couldn't either. As far as he knew, the old toad didn't have essence sight. He didn't even know how the frogs sensed essence. Even so, Cade wasn't about to give up without checking. With little more than a thought, the scenery shifted once again. The ash-white root pillar vanished, replaced by the massive black pillar entwined with shimmering rainbow-veined roots around its shaft. The tortoises had gathered around here. Brahm stood near the front while the few remaining tortoises surrounded the enormous golden form of Verosk. A smile tugged at Cade's non-existent lips. Good to see you, old man. I hope the tortoises enjoyed the taste of your mucus. Just like before, Cade tried to interact with them but they didn't give the slightest reaction. He called out several times, waved his non-existent arms through the air, and even attempted to move through Brahm. His incorporeal form passed harmlessly through the brazen young tortoise. Cade sighed. So much for that. What about Acolion? He hadn't seen the giant gator anywhere in either pack and a knot formed in his chest. The frogs and tortoises were both here and seemed to be fine, but Acolion, he wasn't native to this realm. Had he been ejected when Cade claimed the core as his own? He immediately began searching. A single thought carried him from place to place throughout the realm. He swept across the surrounding fields of desolate ash as well as the swampy jungle the frogs had left behind on their way to the great tree. Each destination appeared before him almost instantly, yet every search ended the same way. Nothing. Please don't tell me the system sent you somewhere else in the tutorial. He searched again, this time more methodically. Every clearing. Every hollow. Every place the oversized gator might have wandered. As he searched he realized the realm was considerably smaller than before, but that was a concern for another time. As he searched, another possibility occurred to him. The hollow under the great tree. The world shifted once more and Cade found himself beneath the great tree itself. The hollow still rested between the three colossal root pillars. A broad grin spread across his face. There you are. Acolian lay comfortably inside, lazily chewing on a thick, gnarled root jutting from the ground. His powerful jaws methodically crushed the wood into splinters. Then the gator froze. His bright aquamarine eyes lifted and locked directly onto Cade. The root slipped from his jaws as his eyes widened. His massive tail immediately began thumping excitedly against the ground. Wait, can he actually see me? Before Cade could think another thought, Acolian bounded forward with an excited chirp and enthusiastically tried to nuzzle him. The attempt failed spectacularly as the giant snout passed harmlessly through Cade's floating consciousness. Acolian paused, tilted his head in confusion before letting out another questioning chirp. Cade laughed. You can see me. He immediately tried projecting his thoughts toward the Viscount, willing the intent behind his words toward the giant gator. Acolian, can you understand me? The gator stared at him for a long moment before cocking his head to the side like a confused dog. Clearly, something was getting through but maybe the Viscount didn't know how to respond. Thump your tail twice if you can understand me. Once if you can't. Another questioning chirp escaped Acolian's throat. A heartbeat later, his massive tail pounded the ground twice in rapid succession. Cade's grin widened. That worked. Acolian thumped his tail twice more, his excitement seemingly impossible to contain. Encouraged, Cade projected another thought. I'm all right, and I'm glad to see you and everyone else survived. I'm glad you're all safe. Acolian responded with another excited chirp before opening his mouth and letting his tongue loll happily to the side. Cade chuckled. I'll take that to mean you're glad I'm safe too. The Viscount thumped his tail against the ground twice more. Tell Vorduin and Verosk I'm all right. Tell them I'll come back and figure out a way to speak with them again. I don't know when, or how, but I'll find a way. Cade hesitated before adding one final thought. I think I left my body back in the tutorial, and I have no idea how time passes between the two realms. I should probably go. Acolian remained perfectly still for several long seconds before giving one slow, deliberate thump of his tail. Cade didn't need words to understand that the Viscount didn't want him to leave. I'm sorry, buddy. I'll come back soon. I promise. In the meantime, why don't you work on forming your core? Acolian responded by slamming his tail against the ground before letting out an indignant huff and turning his back on Cade. Ah, don't be mad little guy. Can you at least deliver my message to Vorduin and Verosk? The oversized gator ignored him completely and resumed chewing on the thick root protruding from the ground. All right, all right. What if I try growing you another root? One sturdy enough to survive those mighty jaws. Will you deliver the message then? Acolian glanced back over his shoulder at Cade's floating consciousness for a long moment before lightly tapping the ground with his tail twice. I knew you'd come around. Focusing his attention on the great tree, he reached toward the vast root system beneath the soil. He gathered his will, intent, and even drew upon his law seed of renewal, directing it into the living roots below. Immediately he felt a tremendous amount of essence rush from his core. The ground trembled as a thick, gnarled root slowly pushed its way through the earth beside Acolian, broader and denser than the one the Viscount had been chewing before. That took way more essence than I expected. The fresh root settled into place with a soft groan. Now, before you start chewing on that one, go give Vorduin and Verosk my message. I'll be back soon. Hopefully with a body next time. Acolian looked from Cade to the newly grown root, then back again before his tail gave another pair of lazy thumps. Cade had the distinct feeling the oversized gator would have delivered the message all along. He had simply seen an opportunity to bargain for a better chew toy before Cade disappeared again. Acolian chirped happily before padding over to the new root. He gave it an experimental bite, his eyes immediately brightening as his powerful jaws failed to leave more than a few shallow grooves in the dense wood. Satisfied, the Viscount gave Cade one final, enthusiastic double thump of his tail before proudly dragging his prize with him as he slowly plodded in the direction of Verosk and the ash tortoises. It seemed like his hypothesis was correct. By using the dungeon core to Cynthia's legacy as his own core, he allowed this realm to continue to exist when it otherwise would have been destroyed. He had kept everyone here safe and gave them more time. And with time, they could all find a new purpose in life, one that resided outside simply training Cynthia's brood. Satisfied with the knowledge that at least part of the realm and everyone within had safely made the transition, Cade willed himself back toward his waiting body in the tutorial. The world around him collapsed into darkness and he felt his mind become compressed again. A heartbeat later, the compression lifted and his eyes snapped open to see pearlescent white ash spiraling around him. With a flick of his will he deactivated the ashen vortex and the particles flowed back into his mantle. Richard's body was gone, completely consumed by the ashen vortex during his absence. Cade looked around to see that Earl had remained exactly where he had left him. Only the bald man was staring with wide, unblinking eyes as though he couldn't decide whether Cade was real or a hallucination. Cade glanced down at himself and flexed his fingers once, reassuring himself that he was truly back in his body. Then he looked over at Earl and offered the man an awkward smile. "I think you and I need to have a nice, friendly chat." Kaylee's long sword carved through the last ghoul's neck, severing its head cleanly from its body. The sickly green light in its eyes guttered out before it even hit the stone floor. She stepped over it without looking down, shield raised and breath steady despite the cold air burning her lungs. Another pack of undead shambled farther down the hall. She and her party had been inside the desolate crypt, Isispear Peak's tutorial dungeon, for almost a week and a half. A week and a half of frozen corridors, burial vaults, ambush chambers, bone pits, and undead that never slept. Thankfully, the undead never followed when they backtracked into cleared sections of the dungeon, which meant the group could hole up in rooms they had already secured and rest. And thanks to the time dilation between the dungeon and the tutorial outside, there was still one day left before the quadrant walls came down. One day. The frozen hall stretched ahead of them, its arched ceiling lost in shadows and frost. Ancient pillars lined both sides, each carved with images of skeletal soldiers kneeling before a robed figure carrying a scythe. Rime coated the stone floor, and sickly green flames burned in bronze braziers along the walls, giving off light but offering no warmth. At the end of the hall stood a pair of bronze double doors nearly 20 feet tall. Undead clustered before them in a final defensive formation. Skeletons in blackened armor carried jagged bone spears. Frost-bitten zombies dragged broken icy blades across the stone. A handful of ghouls clung to the pillars and ceiling, their long limbs twitching as they prepared to spring. Ron stepped forward before Kaylee could give the order. The tall, skinny man lifted both hands, fire gathering between his fingers in bright orange spheres. "About time I warmed this place up," he joked. Then he unleashed his spell. Fireballs streaked down the hall one after another, each one screaming through the cold before detonating among the undead. Skeletons blew apart and zombies ignited. Ghouls dropped from the ceiling in burning heaps, shrieking as they hit the floor. Ron kept casting until the far end of the corridor became a rolling wash of flame and black smoke. When the last burning corpse stopped moving, Kaylee raised one hand. "Hold!" Her party stopped immediately. That, more than anything, pleased her. They had each been talented individuals before entering the dungeon. Now they moved like a seasoned unit, falling into position without orders and covering one another without hesitation. "We'll rest here," Kaylee said. No one argued. Jen lowered herself onto a broken piece of stone with a heavy exhale, both spiked tower shields resting against her knees. The short, broad woman's armor had been clawed open in multiple places, but she still looked like she would headbutt the next undead that tried to touch her squad. Ron leaned against a pillar and flexed his fingers, faint smoke curling from his palms. Mark sat cross-legged near the wall, light leather armor scuffed and torn, the smile on his unassuming face doing nothing to hide his exhaustion. He carried no weapons, but he didn't need any. His method of healing was strange, but effective. It had also saved more than one life. Who knew you could heal someone by punching them in the back of the head? Callahan checked his crossbow in silence, methodical as ever. The scout commander's beard had more frost than grey in it now. A shallow cut ran along his cheek where he refused to let Mark slap it away, but his eyes stayed sharp. Henry Whitehollow, her father, dropped down beside a pillar and rested his new blunderbuss across his lap. The weapon was far better than the crude one he had carried earlier in the tutorial. Items bought from the tutorial store were better than anything her gunsmiths could make. Her father grinned. Well, if nothing else, this place has been generous with experience. I've leveled up so much I nearly caught up with Kaylee. Ron snorted. That's one way to describe being neck-deep in corpses for 10 days. Undead, not corpses, Henry said. We make them into corpses. It's an important distinction. Kaylee allowed herself a small smile. Her father was right. They had all leveled several times since entering the tutorial dungeon. If the final chamber gave what she expected, she might even reach level 35 before they left. That thought warmed her more than the fire ever could have. Her gaze moved to the bronze double doors at the end of the hall and a system screen appeared in her mind. General Tarn's ritual chamber. Kaylee's pulse quickened but she kept her face calm. Out of everything the system had given her, her assistant was easily one of the most valuable. The amount of information it provided could be overwhelming at times, but information was power. In this tutorial, it was the difference between walking a path that ended in the tutorial or one that followed the limitless path of the system. In this case, it gave her a detailed breakdown of General Tarn's defenses on the other side of those doors. She looked over to her party. Those doors lead to General Tarn's ritual chamber, Kaylee said. Everyone's attention snapped to her. When everyone's resources are at least 80%, we go in. Jen and I will open the doors. The rest of you will get into formation Delta behind us. Her gaze shifted from Henry to Ron, then Mark. As soon as the doors open, total commitment. Henry's grin widened. Finally, Ron said. Henry reached into his pack and pulled out a metal sphere the size of his meaty fist. He turned it once in his hand, admiring the rune work the crafters had inscribed, then loaded it into the mouth of his blunderbuss. I've been saving this beauty, and total commitment is just the right occasion to use her, Henry said with obvious satisfaction. The remaining time passed in near silence. One by one, each member of the party signaled that they were ready. Henry and Ron took the front of the rear formation with Mark and Callahan positioned behind them. Jen approached the left door while Kaylee took the right. Jen set her shields down within arm's reach, then wrapped both hands around the massive bronze handle. Kaylee kept her sword sheathed in her kite shield on her back. Even from 50 feet away, she could feel mana building around Ron. Kaylee glanced back and Henry met her eyes before nodding once. Kaylee turned forward. Now. She and Jen pulled. The bronze doors groaned as they opened just enough for a 3-foot-wide gap between them. Cold green light spilled through the crack and a raspy voice drifted out from the chamber beyond. So, General Tarn said, each word scraping through the air like bone against stone. You and your little band have finally arrived. No matter. As a master of death, time is one luxury I possess in abundance. You, however. Boost. Mark shouted as he slapped one hand against Henry's back and the other against Ron's. Henry's blunderbuss roared. Triplicate. The fist-sized metal sphere shot through the gap between the doors, then split into 3 identical projectiles mid-flight, each one screaming into the chamber beyond. At the same time, Ron thrust both hands forward. Firenado. A bolt of crimson fire rushed past Kaylee's shoulder and through the opening directly behind Henry's triple shot, dragging a spiral of heat in its wake. General Tarn's monologue ended there. As soon as Henry's blunderbuss roared, Jen released the door handle. She dropped low, snatched both spiked shields from the floor, and drove herself into the gap between the open doors. Her knees hit the frozen stone with a heavy crack, but she ignored the pain. Both shields came up a heartbeat later and locked together to block the entrance. Kaylee drew her long sword and stepped behind her. She raised her blade over the top of the shields and watched Henry's triple shot tear into the chamber beyond. The 3 metal spheres slammed into a sickly green barrier and detonated. The explosions hit in a rough triangle, each impact spreading cracks of volatile white light through the undead's magic. The barrier rippled as a triangular hole tore open at its center. Ron's crimson bolt shot through the gap before the magic could mend itself. The chamber's interior erupted. Fire twisted outward in a violent spiral, blooming into a roaring tornado that filled the center of the ritual chamber. Zombies vanished inside the flames. Skeletons blackened and burst apart. Ghouls shrieked as fire crawled over their limbs until nothing was left but black ash. At least 100 undead had been waiting on the other side of those doors. Ron's magic burned most of them in seconds. But through the storm of fire, Kaylee saw him. An undead figure stood at the back of the chamber, draped in a tattered black robe that barely concealed the bones and rotted flesh beneath. One skeletal hand gripped a long scythe, its blade glowing with the same sickly green light as the barrier. The undead turned toward her. Her assistant brought up a screen in her mind. General Tarn level 36. Commander of the Undead Legion that once infested Isis Pier Peak. Kaylee's grip tightened around her sword. She had already been feeding mana and stamina through her arm and into the blade. The power gathered there, waiting for release. She pointed the sword directly at General Tarn. Judgment of the Vanguard, she whispered. Light detonated from the tip of her blade. This beam was only a meter wide, but far more concentrated than her earlier judgments. It tore across the ritual chamber in a blinding ray of incandescent brilliance. The sickly green barrier shattered as the beam punched through it. Ron's fire tornado split around the attack, flames bending away from the light. General Tarn raised his free hand and a personal magic shield snapped into place in front of him. Kaylee's judgment broke that too. The shield took some of the force, but not enough. The beam slammed into the undead general and blasted away his left arm and half of his torso. Rotted flesh and blackened bone scattered across the ice behind him. Tutorial Dungeon Quest updated, silence the desolate crypt. Progress. Stop the ritual, 1/1. Slay General Tarn, 0/1. Destroy General Tarn's phylactery, 0/1. Kaylee allowed herself a small smirk of satisfaction. General Tarn was damaged, his ritual had been stopped, and his forces had been devastated in their opening salvo. She quietly thanked her assistant. With its information, she knew total commitment had been the right call. Now it was time to finish this damned dungeon. Kaylee lowered her sword and tapped Jen once on the back. Jen surged to her feet and charged. She made it only a few steps into the chamber before the trap waiting behind the doors revealed itself. Two massive ghouls, each nearly 12 feet tall, lunged from either side. Their grey skin stretched tight over swollen muscles. Each one wielded a giant spiked mace of dark metal. They swung at Jen from both sides in a brutal pincer. Jen dropped behind her shields. Shield wall. Reflection. The maces crashed into her shields hard enough to make the chamber shake, but the impact did not move her. Instead, both ghouls' heads caved in at the same time, as if their own weapons had struck them. Their skulls folded inward with wet cracks and their massive bodies toppled sideways. Kaylee rushed past them as Ron's fire tornado snuffed itself out. The sudden absence of flame left drifting ash, scorched bone, and piles of charred corpses scattered across the chamber floor. A few undead still moved among the remains, but she ignored them. Jen, Ron, Henry, Mark, and Callahan could handle stragglers. Kaylee wanted the general. She reached over her shoulder and pulled her kite shield from her back as she ran. General Tarn staggered but did not fall. Half his torso was gone and one arm had been blasted away, but green fire still burned in the hollows of his half-rotted eyes. He dragged his scythe up with his remaining arm and swept it toward her. Soul sever, he rasped. The blade flashed sickly green. Warning, direct contact will inflict severe soul damage. Kaylee adjusted instantly, stepped inside the arc, caught the haft with the edge of her sword, and redirected the blade above her head. The green edge hissed past without touching so much as a hair. Then she ran her blade down the shaft, turned her wrist, and cut upward. Her sword sheared through General Tarn's remaining arm. The scythe clattered across the ice, but Kaylee did not stop. A flick of her blade removed his jaw. A thrust punched through his ruined chest and severed his spine below the ribs. A sweeping cut split what remained of his torso, sending pieces of robe, bone, and rotten flesh across the floor. Still, the green flames did not go out. Kaylee stepped in and slammed the edge of her shield into his face. Tarn's skull cracked, and his eyes flickered. He was nearly dead, but not everyone had contributed to the battle. She released the shield, grabbed him by the skull, and lifted what remained of his head and upper torso into the air. Callahan, she called. Take the shot. A crossbow string snapped and a moment later a bolt struck, punching cleanly into one of General Tarn's flickering eye sockets. Kaylee drove her sword through the back of his skull and the green flames vanished. Ding! You have defeated Tarn, General of the Desolate Crypt level 36. You have gained additional experience for killing a creature above your level. Race, Human, F, has reached level 35. +2 to all stats. Tutorial quest updated, Cull the Undead. Progress. Captain slain, 7 of 8. General slain, 1 of 1. Tutorial dungeon quest updated, Silence the Desolate Crypt. Progress. Stop the ritual, 1/1. Slay General Tarn, 1/1. Destroy General Tarn's phylactery, 0/1. Kaylee let General Tarn's remains fall to the floor. The ruined torso hit the ice with a brittle crack. She stepped over it and scanned the room while the rest of her party finished clearing the remaining undead. Jen had already drawn the last of the stragglers toward her, both spiked shields raised as 3 skeletons hacked uselessly against them. Ron flicked 2 fingers, and a ribbon of fire curled around the nearest skeleton's spine before burning through it. Henry's blunderbuss boomed a moment later, reducing a ghoul to a spray of frozen meat and bone. Callahan put a bolt through the skull of a crawling zombie before it reached Mark's ankle. These were good people. They were her people. Her gaze moved across the ritual chamber. The room was enormous, with walls of black stone and ice-covered pillars rising into the ceiling. Most of the floor had been carved with circular inscriptions, though Ron's firenado had destroyed large sections of them. Molten grooves cut through the symbols. Those inscriptions must have powered the ritual. Whatever General Tarn had been trying to accomplish, it had ended the moment Ron's fire tore through his ritual circle. Kaylee looked farther into the chamber and saw the throne. It sat at the back of the room, carved entirely from pale blue ice. Frost crawled across its arms and down its base, spreading outward. Set into the center of the backrest was a small sickly green orb, pulsing with a slow, diseased light. A system screen appeared in her mind. Kaylee read it, and a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She crossed the chamber while the others finished their work. The orb pulsed faster as she approached, the green light within it swirling like smoke. Kaylee lifted her sword and, with a few precise cuts, sliced the orb free from the ice throne. Cold seeped through her glove as soon as she picked it up, but she ignored the sensation and turned back toward her party. The last of the undead fell a few seconds later. Ron lowered his hands, smoke curling from his fingers. Jen straightened, her shields dented and clawed but intact. Henry rested his blunderbuss against one shoulder and gave the room a slow look, while Callahan nervously reloaded his crossbow just in case. Mark sprinted behind Jen and slapped her in the back of the head. "Damn it, Mark, I don't need healing, none of the bonies got through my shields this time," Jen snapped. "I know, I've just been wanting to do that for a while now," Mark said with a chuckle. Kaylee shook her head at Mark's antics and held up the orb. "This is General Tarn's phylactery," she said. "It is also the core of this dungeon. Once it's destroyed, we should be transported back to the tutorial." Ron grinned. "Sounds good to me. I've had enough undead ice tunnels to last a lifetime." "There's more," Kaylee said, and the group immediately quieted. Her assistant had already supplied the relevant information. It was one of the reasons she had pushed them through this dungeon so aggressively. Experience was valuable. Quest rewards were valuable. But this was something that was priceless. "This tutorial dungeon core has another function besides teleporting us out of here," she said. "A very valuable one." Henry's expression sharpened. "When this core is destroyed, 5 participants who contributed to its destruction can receive a boost to their own system cores," Kaylee said. "It can upgrade core quality, which affects future growth. It may even influence class evolution at level 50. Someone with a rare class could receive epic options. Possibly even better, depending on the individual and the feats they performed from levels 1 through 49. For a moment, silence filled the chamber. Then Ron let out a breathless laugh. "You're kidding. I am not." His grin widened. That's insane. Do you know what people would pay for something like that?" "More than any of us have," Henry said. Callahan looked from the orb to the group, then his brow furrowed. "There are 6 of us." "Yep," Kaylee said. Callahan straightened. "Then I'll sit this one out. I wasn't originally supposed to be part of this assault team anyway. I only came because you needed someone who knew the route and could handle scouting." "No," Kaylee said. "You 5 will be the ones accepting this reward. With respect, Paragon." Callahan inclined his head. "I gained 3 levels from my contribution to the fight with General Tarn. That is more than enough reward for me. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity, but a reward that big would be wasted on someone like me." Kaylee looked at him for a long moment. "Nonsense," she finally said. Callahan blinked. "You are as much a part of this group's success as anyone else," she said. "You fought through the dungeon with us. You scouted, mapped routes, found traps, and put a bolt through General Tarn's eye when I called for it. You will not be excluded because you think your contribution was not enough." Callahan's mouth tightened, but he did not argue. I will sit this one out, Kaylee said. The 5 of you will damage the core, with Henry dealing the final blow. Henry looked at her, uncertainty plain beneath the frost clinging to his braided beard. Kaylee met her father's eyes and tilted her head slightly, just enough to give him the signal. Paragon, Callahan said carefully, I mean no disrespect, but upgrading your core would be far more beneficial to everyone than upgrading mine. The settlement depends on you. The quadrant depends on you. Hell, this entire tutorial depends on you. Kaylee raised one hand and Callahan stopped speaking immediately. My decision is final, she said. Then she tossed him the dungeon core and Callahan caught it on instinct. Damage it, Kaylee said. That's an order, Scout Commander Callahan. He hesitated for half a breath, then pulled a crossbow bolt from his quiver and struck the core with the metal tip, causing a thin scratch on its surface. He passed it to Mark. Mark took it carefully, glanced once at Kaylee, then scratched it with a small utility knife from his belt. Jen went next, pressing one spike from her shield into the orb until a crack formed. Ron burned a thin black mark across the surface with a line of concentrated flame. Finally, the core reached Henry. Her father crouched and set it on the frozen floor. He adjusted his grip on the blunderbuss, then looked up at Kaylee one last time. She gave him the smallest nod. Henry brought the butt of the weapon down and the dungeon core shattered. White swallowed Kaylee's vision. The next thing she knew, she stood on an endless white floor that stretched beneath her feet in every direction. An equally endless expanse surrounded her on every side. Nothing but infinite white, broken by a single figure seated behind a pristine white desk. Kaylee's jaw tightened. She remembered this room from the initialization. She remembered the way the system entity had sat behind that desk, calm and unreadable, offering her power and a very suspicious title for her contribution to the system's expansion into the 111th universe. The figure looked up and spoke directly into her mind. I offer my congratulations, Kaylee Whitehollow. You have successfully completed the tutorial dungeon. Cut the shit. The entity stopped. Kaylee stepped closer to the desk, not bothering to hide the irritation in her voice. We both know why I'm here, and we both know you're going to give me some kind of reward. I don't care what skill you plan to offer. Convert it into an information request. That is impossible. Skill rewards for completing the tutorial dungeon quest cannot be converted into an information request. Kaylee's eyes narrowed. You and I made a deal, she said. I accepted your title. I took on the role you wanted me to take because you said it was the only way to keep my family safe. The white system entity remained perfectly still. You gave me part of what I wanted, Kaylee continued. You couldn't find Cassandra and I accepted that as fact. You made sure my father was with me, you gave me power in this new world, an assistant that could give me almost any information I might need to stay on the system's limitless path. But you have not completely held up your end of the bargain. She placed both hands on the desk and leaned forward. Tell me where my brother is. Where is Cade Whitehollow? Information request granted. Cade Whitehollow has just finished the tutorial dungeon, Cynthia's Legacy. Shock cracked through her expression before she could stop it. Cynthia's Legacy? She had never heard of that dungeon. Her assistant had given her information on Isispear Peak, the desolate crypt, the burial pits, the mausoleums, General Tarn, and all but one of the undead captains. It had never mentioned anything called Cynthia's Legacy. But Cade had completed a tutorial dungeon. For a moment, pride rose in her chest. Cade was coreless. He would have been useless, yet somehow he had survived a tutorial dungeon. Maybe he had found a good group. Maybe some decent people had taken him in and protected him. Maybe they had let him come along, kept him alive, and dragged him through the tutorial dungeon. That was the only way he could have completed it. Kaylee didn't care how he had survived. Only that he had. But her relief lasted only a second before anger returned. You were supposed to put him in my tutorial, she said. That was part of the deal. Cade Whitehollow was supposed to be placed where I could find him. Where I could keep him safe. Information request granted. Cade Whitehollow would not have survived without a system core in Isispear Peak, even with your help. He was placed in the primeval quagmire, a less dangerous part of your tutorial. Kaylee's fingers curled against the white desk as a memory flashed through her mind. Falling from the sky at the start of the tutorial. The frozen mountain rising beneath her. The vast, sprawling green to her right. It was a swamp biome. Cade had to be there. He was in the same tutorial as her, separated only by the quadrant barrier. And the walls would come down in less than a day. Kaylee let go of the desk and slowly straightened. For the first time since entering the white room, she smiled. I guess that is good enough, she said. Now, show me what skills you would offer your chosen.